It's an honor to be here and to share with you just a quick biographical sketch for me and sort of how I ended up here and in this field of study. So I grew up, maybe I think unlike both of you, I grew up in an atheistic environment, and my parents were hippies, no rules, pretty free household, good times. My dad was a jazz musician, and I didn't really think about God at all growing up. It wasn't a subject in my house. And toward the end of my high school, I moved from atheist to agnostic. And then toward the end of high school, my best friend, who's still my best friend to this day, started having some problems. And he shares with me late night after playing tennis that he had a relationship with God through faith in Christ. And I thought, what are you talking about? And he said, God was real. And as he talked about it, I thought, I think this guy's right. And so, but I'd never prayed in my life. So the first prayer of my life was a prayer for faith, which I look back on and think, well, that was a pretty good start. It was a prayer for faith. So I ended up studying history. I went to a Christian college kind of last minute. I met my wife in seminary. So there were no cookies involved, but it was in an archaeology lecture, and my first class of graduate study was Hebrew. And I'll never forget, my professor was a Harvard Ph.D., and he introduced us to the Hebrew language by teaching us the name of Micaiah, who is like the Lord. And that the name is a question. And he said that the answer to that question is that there is none like the Lord. And I was just weeping. And I thought, I'm in the right place. And that was my introduction to Hebrew. And I grew to love the study of the scriptures. I started, you would never have guessed this about me in high school, that I would end up becoming a pastor. So I was pastoring in New England, teaching biblical studies, and once you start learning the scriptures, it's like a healthy addiction. And so I just wanted more and more of that. And I remember thinking, boy, I just would love to know more about this. I didn't even have a very, very specific vocational trajectory. And I'd heard great things about Hebrew Union. And so my wife and I applied and matriculated. I think we were the first couple to matriculate into the PhD program, and came here to study. And so big movement from a atheist, agnostic, to a Christian, pastor, biblical studies, and then wanting to study more. And coming here, I just want to say publicly here in the library, like, our years at Hebrew Union College just are one of the greatest gifts of our life. And what we learned here, what we studied here, and to be able to access this material in its original voice is something that I use on a daily basis. So I'm very grateful for Hebrew Union. Dr. Saracen was one of my doctoral advisors. And I think for me, meeting Paul, I met Paul in some ways how Jason described him, kind of a Protestant reading. And then as I started learning and reading the sources, I found this man is a deeply Jewish thinker, and came to see that, understand that. And so I ended up in some unusual places. I ended up here when I was a student at Hebrew Union. I was the Hebrew TA for the rabbinic students. So that was kind of odd and yet wonderful that here's the Christian pastor in the graduate school and I'm teaching Hebrew to the rabbis in training. And yet, it was profound, the friendships that developed in there and some of the questions that we had space and freedom to ask each other. And one of the students, David, same name as me at one point, he was struggling with Hebrew, and I was meeting with him one-on-one, and we were talking about it and reading these texts together. And then he just stunned me. He looked at me and he said, David, he said, it's like I've got the Torah up here, but you've got the Torah right here. And, we wept. And I'll never forget that conversation. And he didn't quote Jeremiah 31, but that's the imagery of Jeremiah 31. And I feel really grateful to be, incorporated into a culture of learning, into a culture where the scripture, when Paul was asked directly, which he was asked many times, what are you teaching? It seems on the one hand that you're deprioritizing Jews and Judaism. Some of his kinsmen had that impression of him. And he said, that's not actually what I'm saying. And when he was pressed and was asked, well, what's the advantage of the Jew? The first thing he says is being entrusted with the oracles of God. And that's a very devout Jewish thought to have. Like, what's really distinctive? Like, we've got these texts, and we were entrusted with them. And so I have ended up now, I'm a pastor here in Cincinnati. I lead a congregation that has 23 native languages spoken in it, about 700 people. You're all invited there tonight. And it's a real gift to serve in a congregation like that. When I was installed as the pastor, one of the things you get to do is you get guest speakers that are going to come and speak about why you should be leading this congregation. And one of the people who came and spoke was Dr. Gringas. And he just gave such a beautiful charge for the role of a pastor scholar. And so I teach now. I teach New Testament, but I also am the only man on the faculty at Gordon Conwell who teaches rabbinics. So I keep in touch with Dr. Saracen, and I love to introduce Christian readers to rabbinic literature because it's more wonderful than they can imagine. And there are great things in them to discover. And at one point, students often end up finding out, like, this sounds a lot like Paul. And so I thought about how could I frame Paul in this setting, this context. Are you able to advance my slides for me, or do I need to do it? So let's see if we can. Go ahead. So famous line in the Mishnah. Yitzi'it hashabad shetayim shehen arba bifnim v'shetayim shehem arba bahut. So there are two. This is a great text to introduce the longest tractate in the Mishnah. There are two goings out of the Sabbath, which are really four for him that's inside the house, and two which are really four for the person outside of the house. And I thought about this text and great affection for this text, and I remember reading through the Mishnah in Hebrew with Dr. Saracen and a number of other rabbinic students, and I always remember the first thing he said to us. He said, does this text assume a tremendous amount of cultural knowledge? And we were like, yes it does. And he said, is this an insider text or an outsider text? And he said, you can read through the Mishnah in Hebrew, word for word, translate it perfectly, and have no idea what they're talking about. So I thought about this passage. If we could go to just the next slide, about Paul, and maybe an invitation to see him from a Christian perspective, a little bit to maybe the stereotype of what Jason was highlighting in the history of interpretation. Sometimes people see Paul as non-Jewish. And in reality, he sees himself as profoundly Jewish. But how do we see his Jewishness actually reflected in his writings? From inside the house, he thinks in deeply Jewish ways. He thinks in deeply Jewish ways about theology. He says it overtly in his letters, God is one. He quotes or alludes to the Shema multiple times. And he believes in the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He believes that Israel has a unique election. There's a chosenness that God, in his mysterious providence, appears to Abraham, calls him in the midst of his idolatry, and he sees in Abraham a unique mission right from the very beginning. Leave everything you've known, go to the land I will show you. Isn't that a terrifying interval? Like, leave everything you've known, and then I'll tell you more in a little while. And yet, in the Genesis narrative, that Lech Lecha in chapter 12 reappears in chapter 22, and there's this profound connection between those two scenes. So, and yet in Genesis 12, go, leave, and I will bless you, but then in you, all the families of the earth, Kol HaMishpachos, will be blessed, or will bless themselves. That there's a consequence to that. And I think Paul deeply believed that. He believed in eschatology. That's kind of a fun, fancy word. But he believed that history was going somewhere, that there was a second great act of redemption that was built on the template of the Exodus redemption, and that there was more to come. And he's not making that up. He's reading that in the prophets. The Exodus is referred to 160 times in the Hebrew Scriptures. So it's the dominant idea. And that's going to happen again, or something like that. He's inside the house in that I think he still teaches and would describe himself as a devout Torah scholar. That was his training under Gamliel. He quotes from the Hebrew Scriptures 85 times explicitly in 13 letters. And then there are many, many more verbal allusions, but those are just the explicit quotations. So he's writing and thinking, like Jacob Neusner says, out of Scripture and scriptural categories. He handles the Scripture in a way that's very similar to Hillel's hermeneutical rules, the Midot. I love to introduce Christian students, and I've even got my congregation at Kenwood to recognize a Kal V'Omer. I really feel like we've really made progress, and they see it, and Paul's writings are filled with it. And that's how he was taught to read the Scripture. He also, though, and this may be surprising to some Jewish readers of Paul, that Paul really has halakhic outcomes that he hopes for in his letters. He is concerned for an ethical embodiment, and if you press him, he actually thinks that his congregations are walking in the ways of Torah and actually fulfilling it. That's what he says. And certain people, and he'll say really kind of paradoxical sentences like, circumcision doesn't matter, it's about just keeping the commandments. And you're like, wait, how does that sentence work? But that's what he says. Love is the fulfillment of the law is what he'll end up saying. And he's not the only Jewish thinker to think that. So I'll end with a view outside the house, or I guess the second part real quick if we go to the next one. How does Paul seem outside the house? He seems outside the house because he comes to believe that Jesus of Nazareth is Israel's promised Messiah. And I think as Christian Jewish scholars together, this is just Paul's own, that's what he thinks. And so we can disagree with him on that, we can agree with him, but that's what he thinks. And his thinking reflects that. And so in light of that, number two, and that differentiates him from some Jews of his day. Celsus is the Roman writer who gives us our first knowledgeable critique of Christianity. And at one section, Celsus goes ahead and bashes Jews and Judaism at first and then bashes Christians. And he says, look, Jews and Christians both share the rather nonsensical notion that a Redeemer is going to come from heaven and save the world. The only thing that's different about Jews and Christians is Christians think he's coming. And that's a Roman aristocrat. And that's how he describes the difference. Secondly, for some of Paul's kinsmen, and even today through the history of interpretation, I think this is critical for understanding, and this connects with Jason's work too, that Paul, I think, understands the restoration of Israel to include this regathering of the scattered tribes, but that it also carries with it the ingathering of all nations to worship the God of Abraham. And, there are hints of this, in the scriptures, Isaiah 2, Micah 4, that the nations of the world are going to stream to Zion and say, teach us the Torah. And I think, and even the ending of the synagogue liturgy with the prayer that the nations would abandon their idolatry and that that God would be one and his name the only one. So I thought in the end, like, what if you've never read Paul? Where would you go to start with? So I teach Paul's writings, teach them in Greek. I really love to do that. And I thought, well, the obvious place to introduce Paul's own voice would be how he introduced himself to people who'd never met him. So how did he do that? And if we just go to the last slide, this is how Paul starts his letter to the Romans, which it's his longest letter. In many ways, it's his most famous. It's his most studied. There are 825 full-length commentaries on this letter. So it's a massive amount of scholarship that no one can completely command. But this was a congregation that he had not started, he had not visited, and they wanted to know who he was. And so he's writing to a mixed group of ethnic Jews, of converts to Judaism, or converts to Christianity. And this is how he introduced himself. He says, I'm Paul. And remember, ancient letters start with identifying yourself as the sender, because there's no envelopes in the ancient world. So who is this guy? He's a servant of Christ Jesus, called an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. So that language of set apart sounds a lot like Jeremiah's call. So he sees himself in that tradition, not apart from it. And he's someone who's set apart for the gospel. He defines the gospel first and foremost as something that God promised beforehand through the prophets. So the gospel isn't something new. It's the fulfillment of what God had said he would do. It's about his son, who's descended from David in his human ancestry. So he's linking the identity of Jesus with the Davidic line. And then was declared Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead. So he believes that has happened. And the Roman world, this is subject for another day, the Roman world had a Son of God figure and the apotheosis of the Roman emperors. So there's a certain engagement with that view here to say this is the real Son of God. It's not Titus or any other deified emperors. He's Son of God in power. And who is that? It's Jesus Christ, our Lord. And I think the first person plural is really significant. And I'm a pastor, so I'm a big fan of the first person plural. And I notice a big difference when people say, I really like your church. Oh, that's not really my church. But there's something really profound that happens when people say, I love our church. And when you use the first person plural, you've drawn a circle that includes the other. And Paul is a ubiquitous first person plural user. And I think that's critical to his identity. And then at the end he says, through Christ, what do we get? We receive two things. We receive grace, which is the forgiveness. This translates hesed in the Septuagint. And we receive God's loving kindness, his mercy. But we also receive apostleship, which is a mission to the rest of the world. Something like in Judaism, tikkun olam is like chosenness is for a consequence to the rest of the world. And he sees himself as obligated to the rest of the world. And that's how he introduces himself. And I think, who is this guy? I think he's a profoundly Jewish thinker. He's operating in Jewish categories. He's reasoning from the Jewish scriptures, but he's doing that in a way that he's come to see that Israel's Messiah has come in Jesus, and that has consequence for the whole world. And so it's my privilege to be here with both these gifted scholars and to be back here at a place that I love and have learned so much. So thank you.
Thank you, panelists. We're not done yet, but we are also way over time. Way more time has been devoted to this. So what we're going to do is, if anybody needs to leave for class, Chris Beecher, who really organized this entire event, is one of those people had to go to class, or if you have other obligations, feel free to go. The cameras will be rolling, so you can get the recording of the Q&A that we're going to do now. And we're going to start that now. And do you want to kind of...
Sure.
You can call on people, and I've also got several good questions on our Zoom attendees, so you can...
Do you want to
let's
start with one of those?
And then all right. So this question is actually probably for our first two panelists. They want to know about the relationship between indulgences and sacrifices.
That's you.
Well, you, because you rolled your eyes a little bit, or
I don't know that I
expressed
did.
some hesitation or surprise.
Well, so I don't think there actually is a very good connection between them. So I think Luther understands. Luther is again reading Paul's letters through a lens in which Paul's opponents are essentially Catholics who are buying indulgences and these sorts of things. And it's a consistent Christian misunderstanding or misrepresentation of the entire sacrificial system, and the system of sacrifices and offerings that you see in the Torah, as primarily about essentially trying to gain forgiveness by making some sort of offering, which I don't think that's what that is at all. I think more Christians would do well to read Milgram, if nothing else. But yeah, I don't think that is actually something that should be connected. I don't think the notion of indulgences or penance in any sort of way like that really makes sense for the sacrificial system. But I do think that historically speaking, when you look at how some of those things were interpreted, those things have been sort of put together, and you get this fairly consistent Christian apologetic that basically boils down to, sacrifice. Sacrifice is just one of those things that it doesn't really work to take away sins the way that Jesus does. Now, some of that. There is an aspect in like Hebrews where it talks about sacrifice and offering do not actually atone, that their sin that sacrifice and offering don't take away. And it is interacting with the sacrificial system, but I think in a much more sophisticated, and actually I think the author of Hebrews understands the sacrificial system better in that sense. He's not arguing for something akin to indulgences there. For him, the question has to do with whether or not sacrifice actually within the Torah, there are sins for which there is not expiation, aside from death or analogous. You've got exile is also held up as a sort of death as well. And Hebrews is interacting with that Torah concept when the author of Hebrews is doing that. But yeah, I think that's probably enough there.
Are there questions from the audience?
I wanted to.
Actually, we got one in the back here first, and then.
Is Galatians a letter from Paul among the scholars? And if it is, then doesn't Paul write in the 3rd chapter of Galatians, doesn't he sound very anti-legalistic when he says that the Jews are those who keep the Torah are under a curse, and you can never really wiggle out of that because nobody's perfect. And so it's very much, it seems to me, a very anti-legalistic argument that he's making over there. And Professor, didn't you say earlier that in your opinion Paul was not taking such a position? But it seems like in Galatians he does. Am I wrong?
I just taught Galatians 3 this week, so let me give a first shot
I
at
think
that.
all of us should talk about it.
Yeah. You said it seems, and that's the word I kind of would build on. I think the real topic in Galatians 3 is who are the descendants of Abraham and how do we recognize them? And the movement of Galatians 3 is really around who are the people among whom God dwells? Where's the Spirit? And so that's how Galatians 3 starts, and it ends with if you have been baptized into Christ, you are Christ, you are descendants of Abraham, you are heirs according to the promise. So if that's how it starts, that's how it ends. I think the language of being accursed is not, I don't think we should take that as, well, you tried hard and you didn't succeed, so you're accursed. I think that's language that Paul is drawing on from the tradition itself, that understanding the exile as being driven out of the land through disobedience, which is, the narrative of Kings. That's the perspective of Ezekiel. So how did we get here and why? And then what is the resolution of that? The resolution in Ezekiel is the return of God's presence, which Paul, I think, sees with the Spirit. And how does that happen? So that's my short answer.
Yeah, I suppose I would say that I think Paul is what we might call a proto-dispensationalist, in the sense that the Torah was God's initial way, his initial dispensation for dealing with the Jewish people. And in that respect, it was good and right and noble, and it ought to have been observed piously. But that since the resurrection, there is a new dispensation. God interacts with Jews and the world in a different way. And in some ways, that's very similar to Islam, saying that, yeah, the Torah was a revelation, but it was an incomplete and now surpassed revelation, and then adding in, yeah, Jews messed it up also by changing words or whatnot. And so I think what he's suggesting in Galatians 3 is that on the one hand, the Galatians need to understand that if they become circumcised and take on the burden of that first dispensation, then they're living in the wrong era. They're understanding their relationship with God in a way that is gone, that is over. But that doesn't mean that Paul is opposed to the observance of certain laws that are in the Torah. Certainly, if those are laws that are good laws and laws that cohere with what a person would do if they are living in the Spirit as well. So sometimes I think it's too harsh to say, Paul is against the law or against legalism. I think it's just a different understanding of an end of times dispensation, which has dramatically changed the way a person, Jew or not Jew, ought to understand the law and interact with the law, but it's not just a wholesale rejection in that sense.
Yeah, so I will wholeheartedly agree with both of the prior statements, and just very quickly add a couple more things. One is, if you look on the back wall there, it has the famous quote from Hillel, the rest is commentary, go and learn. I think Paul completely agrees with that. And if you look at what he says, love fulfills the law, right? Love your neighbor as yourself fulfills the whole Torah. That's what he says in Galatians, at the end of Galatians. Love fulfills the Torah. This does it. This does the whole thing, which, by the way, suggests that he thinks the Torah needs to be fulfilled. But the issue for him is how, in this new dispensation, in this new era, he thinks that an age to come, he thinks there's an additional age to come, but he thinks a new age has begun with the resurrection of Jesus. And the new age then involves the Torah being written on the heart by receiving the Spirit, such that then people, I think when he understands having received the Spirit, he thinks that receiving the Spirit has solved the love God problem, which he sees as endemic through the biblical witness. Israel, if you read Deuteronomy, God himself says, Moses says, to this day, Adonai has not given you a heart to know or eyes to see or ears to hear, or so on. And you have this refrain, and at the end of Deuteronomy, so I put this in the book of the law, in the book of the Torah, so that this will be a witness against them. And Jubilees picks this up, in the Second Temple period, where it does the same thing. And you have this notion that the Torah itself serves as a witness against disobedient Israel, such that Israel falls under the curses of the covenant. And what Paul's arguing is, look, if you receive the Spirit, then you're no longer under the curse, because the curse only applies up until the new age comes, and now you receive the Spirit in the new age, and now you have the love of God in your hearts that the Torah itself promises, and now all that's left is go and learn and love your neighbor. So you're going to fulfill the law the way that the law should be fulfilled. And this is how this is supposed to be done in this new Messianic era for him. And then he says, but if you're going to, try to do this and go back and be circumcised and bring yourself under the written material that is for the prior age, then you're essentially revisiting that prior dispensation, and now you're just standing under the very curses for which the Messiah was supposed to come to redeem Israel. So now you're stuck. You're misunderstanding the age in which you live. I think that's the fundamental thing. But he is not opposed to Torah, to obedience to Torah in any way in that sense. He just sees it as something that is a contingency until Israel receives the heart to be fully obedient in this new era. And I think that's his point of emphasis.
Other questions from,
You want to get that one before and then I'll share.
okay.
Just to follow up on that, do you think that the destruction of the temple is anywhere in the mindset of Paul as he's talking about the aspect of living in Torah and communicating or connecting with God?
Well, he dies before the temple is destroyed.
Of course.
But so,
Is there writing on the wall?
well, I think, I guess what I would point to is, he's not the only first century Jew who's concerned about how the temple is actually functioning. And so you have other renewal movements within Judaism, like Qumran and others who are saying we're not sure that what's going on there is 100% kosher. So I think though that he does say in Ephesians 2 and 3 that he sees the congregation, this combination of ethnic Jews and converted Gentiles, and describes them as a living sanctuary, as a building made with living stones, which I think really is a reflection on Ezekiel 1, where you see the throne of God is like alive. It's a piece of furniture that's living, and that again that goes back to the Spirit and my reading of Paul, that the Spirit isn't just the subjective presence of God in my life, but that the Spirit is the Shekinah, the indwelling of God dwelling in the midst of his people. And he's, even in Corinthians, when he says that a non-believer, a pagan, walks into the congregation gathering and senses God is here, and the thoughts of their heart are made known, and then says, God dwells among you. So I think he's engaging in that. And of course you have the synoptic words recorded of Jesus that the sanctuary will come down. So I'll let you guys speak to that.
Well, Paul does talk about the temple, and actually to bolster what I said earlier, quite famously in 1 Corinthians, talks about Jews at the temple and says, consider Israel according to the flesh, which is an interesting way to distinguish Israel, suggesting that there is some other kind of Israel, corresponding to what I said before, that Paul can say, well, there's Israel, and then there's Israel, and sometimes just leaves it blank, but there, I think, gives us quite an obvious clue that there are different meanings for Israel. I would also remind us that in the 20 or so years that I think are represented in Paul's epistles, he spends, of those 20 years, at most a month in Jerusalem. All of the rest of the time is spent in Damascus, Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Athens, and so on and so forth, where I think that he's interacting with diasporic Jewish communities that themselves don't really think that much about the temple, except that it is kind of the home base that they know they're supposed to care about and give money to, but it's not an integral part of their social or cultural or religious life. I think Paul is actually one of the best witnesses to that phenomenon in the diaspora.
But he does also plan his travel to be present at these in Acts. So he's
but that we don't want to talk. You don't want me to talk about the historicity of Acts.
But I just mean the way it's presented.
Yeah.
Yes.
And even at that, it's only once that he's doing that. So,
as a teacher of mine once said, Acts has an axe to grind.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's been more than adequately answered on that. All I'll say is that in First Thessalonians, there's a passage where he suggests that those who killed Jesus and the prophets have come under the wrath of God. And this has actually been sort of a clobber passage used against Jews historically. If there were one comma that I could remove from the majority of English translations of the Bible, it would be in that section of verses where he says, "You became imitators of the churches of God that are in Judea, for you have also endured suffering at the hands of your countrymen, like they did from the Jews." And then there's usually a comma, the Jews, comma, who killed Jesus and the prophets, et cetera, which sounds like it's like Jews, a positive, those people who killed, but that comma is not there in Greek. It's a relativizing thing. It's specifically the Jews who killed Jesus. And he says, wrath has now come upon them. And in that sense, I think he, like many other first century Jews, expected that the Jewish temple was going to be destroyed imminently. I do think that that's the case. I think there's evidence that in early Christianity that was an expectation. Jesus seems to have prophesied against it in very Jeremianic fashion. So, this is not out of the question for there to be a sort of Jewish prophetic strain that has strong feelings about the mishandling of things in Jerusalem and at the temple. I think Paul was among the folks that had his misgivings about that. So, but I don't think that it plays that much in, partly because it's just much later.
Did you have a question earlier? Did you have a question earlier? Or was it answered? Okay. Anybody else in the audience?
Sorry, no, go.
Ryan.
Ryan,
Give
go.
somebody attention.
Yeah, of course.
Go ahead, Ryan. It's all you.
Oh, you want, okay. Dr. Staples, a question for you. Seems like the Paul within Judaism scholars put great emphasis on the idea that the nations will come back with Israel to worship alongside them, the God of Israel. In your reading, if Gentiles become Israel, is there still room in Paul's mind for this eschatological vision of genuine Gentiles coming alongside Israel?
Yeah, I think so. This is something I've been playing with more recently as I've kind of been reflecting on some of this. So, noting first of all, I think it's important to note that Paul does not say the Gentiles are coming into Christ or whatever. These are Gentiles. These are some Gentiles that are coming in. And they are being grafted into the olive tree in Romans 11. They're coming into Christ. They're heirs of Abraham. And of course, who is the heir of Abraham except for Israel, right? So they're becoming incorporated into Israel. But then there's also other possibilities of, okay, what happens among those who don't become incorporated in that way, but then sort of perhaps at the second coming, at a variety of different points, you've got the possibility of these other nations that come in another fashion that they worship in that way. I think that he does leave room for a sort of righteous Gentile category of those who are not actually in the tree, but then are impacted by this later category. I think that's viable in Paul. I don't know that we see a whole lot of it because he's very much more concerned about those who are coming in and present and arguing for their full status. And I think that's a possibility for him. And I think the degree to which people have certainty about who Paul thinks is in and out in the long haul, I think we need to have maybe a little bit less than that, or at least I have a little bit less certainty these days than I used to.
Great, thank you.
One of our questions online, they want to know what would Paul say about modern non-Jews, Christians or other Gentiles, practicing like the Jewish ritual laws, like kosher dietary laws, things like that, as a means of getting close to God, or what would be the role of those things?
You take that one first.
I feel like that's a question for a pastor. To try to make the 2,000-year-old texts of Christianity speak to contemporary issues is a homiletical religious exercise less than a historical exercise. I would say I suspect that the first thing Paul would say if he arrived in a DeLorean in the HUC parking lot would be, I'm shocked to see that the world still exists, because I'm quite certain he thought that Jesus would be returning in the nigh. And so given that disappointment, I think it's kind of hard. Let me say one more thing. I think he was an incredibly smart, careful reader, and his initial reaction might have been, "Oh my goodness, Jesus hasn't come back yet." I'd say give him 5 years, and I suspect he would work out a very elaborate plan for exactly why what's happened has happened, what's about to happen. I don't know how he'd weigh in on whether Christians should start, avoiding Skyline chili. I don't know where he'd come down, but I suspect he'd have a well thought out opinion on it.
I
You think it would take 5 years? I'm giving him less than a month.
I think it's an interesting phenomenon too. I think I would want to just reframe that slightly to say, the church historically lost its ability to read Hebrew. You have just a handful of early church writers who know Hebrew. And that knowledge is really reacquired by the church through Jewish teachers in the medieval period. And so I would say our communities get stronger and healthier and better when there is that intellectual exchange. I learned to read Rashi's commentary here as a student, and I had not known of him before, and I found here's this whole world of careful readers asking questions that I never would have thought to ask. I think that there are tremendous resources for understanding the scripture in that history of interpretation. There are real insights to be gained by Jewish and Christian scholars looking at the text together and being honest about what they see that's different or has different consequence for their community. I think sometimes we live in a time where people are starved for transcendence. We live in an aggressively imminent age that's constantly telling us that everything that's really, really important is going to happen in a 30-second interval. And that's not really true. And we have at our house the 100-year test. We used to tell our kids, are people going to be talking about this in 100 years? And our kids would say, no. And then we say, well, then we're not going to be talking about it either. So we want to talk about things that are really lasting. But I think sometimes Christians come in to Judaism from the outside, and they're kind of hungry for, a life of faith is meant to be lived in real time. And there are ways in which the Jewish tradition has done that remarkably well. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 is a famous passage for Christians and for Jews, but they cite the line that is the most important differently. And I think it shows the difference in how we're reading the text. Christians cite that, trust the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. And then it kind of trails off. In all your ways acknowledge him, he will direct your paths. And when Jews read that and quote that, they say, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him. So there's a deep, wide, centuries of reflection of how do we live this out in a way that keeps us mindful of holiness. So I think that I don't think it's fair or necessarily that helpful to just sort of parachute into that and pick and choose that. I will tell you another very, very briefly, just profound moment that happened for me as a student. I pastor a Baptist church. Half of our congregation, about 700 people, don't even know it's a Baptist church if you ask them, and because the denominational identity is not that important to people increasingly. But one of the features of our church is we eat a lot together, and it's really it's an important part of the community and the shared table. And of course, that's deeply rooted in. The first commandment of God is here's what you can eat and not eat. And so, the application of holiness in Leviticus 11 starts with the table. And so again, I was teaching all of these rabbinical students Hebrew, and somewhat, naively did what I normally would think to do. We just invited everyone to come to our house. And we spent hours and hours cooking this meal for everyone. And, we love to have people at our house, and everyone was there. And no one was eating. And it got just slightly awkward. And I didn't know, what's wrong? And one of the rabbinical students kind of pulled me aside. He pulled me into the other room and he said, I'm so sorry. If these had been served on paper plates, we could have eaten. And it was an intense moment, actually, because we had really poured ourselves into the preparation. And I didn't know what to do. It's rare for a pastor to be at a loss for words. I didn't know what to do. And this rabbinical student leader, after he told me that, he kind of gathered himself and he walked into my kitchen and he started singing. And he started singing Hine Ma Tovu Manai. And he ate. And that was his decision. But I think all of us were really impacted by what's happening here. And we want to share this meal somehow, and if I had known, I would have done differently. And it was another unforgettable moment. So those are not easy things, and those are the very dynamics that Paul's life and ministry was filled with.
Not coincidentally, there have been people who have said that the crux interpretum of early Christianity is the so-called Antioch incident. What happened in Galatians 2:11 and following when Peter and Paul, and Barnabas and whatnot at Antioch had this falling out? Another big question is what happened afterwards, which we're not sure. But the issue there, I think, without any shadow of a doubt, is conviviality. It's this problem of this early community of Jews and non-Jews, Jews, eating together. Now, whether the issue was kosher foods or simply issues of Jews sharing a table with Gentiles in the first place, conviviality is at the very foundation of Christianity. And here it is fascinating that 2,000 years later, it's still an issue.
Well, and even to something like circumcision, which is, this is something I had a small footnote in my book about, because, Paul has strong objections to Gentile men getting circumcised in order to become a part of the people. He says this is the wrong. You're going the wrong way. You're going about this the wrong way. Having begun in the spirit, are you going to complete the work on the flesh? No. But here's the real question: conviviality. What happens if a Jewish Jesus-following woman in that community marries the uncircumcised Gentile man who has the Spirit? What are they supposed to do when they have their first boy at 8 days old? What are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to circumcise him or not? That's a different question than should you be circumcised to come in the first place. Now, I think Paul would say, go ahead and circumcise the boy. I think he would suggest that.
Which he seems to advocate for in the case of Timothy.
Right.
Because saying don't do that is overstating his view.
Right.
Because overstating his view is to say, are you really about just jettisoning this heritage? And I think he would say, no, I'm not.
I think he would have said, you can circumcise the child as long as you acknowledge that circumcising the child is not what is bringing him into the covenant.
Yeah.
It's adiaphora. You're doing it because it's an old, quote Kaplan, it's an old folk way. We still do that, but it's not salvific. It's not significant. So if you have to do it, do it.
Yeah.
Just know that it doesn't mean anything.
And I 100% agree with that. But I think he actually would have said, for the sake of conscience, not for your conscience, but for other people, circumcise the boy. It's not going to hurt him later.
And in Romans 14, he says, look, you whether it's the festival calendar, Shabbat, dietary laws, circumcision, If you want to do that, do it. I think he ends up basically saying, just don't require everyone to hold your view. You know, so there's a lot of space in it.
He does call the observers the weak.
Yeah, you know, there's a little dig there. That's true. That's true. That's
Got
right.
skin in the game, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, you can read that a couple different ways in terms of social locations. So.
Right, I think we should wrap up.
Okay.
But, we had a bunch more questions online, and if anybody would you feel comfortable sharing your email addresses if people want
Sure.
to share?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Great. And if you want to
Thank you.
continue the conversation, we'll continue it tonight at 7:00 at Kenwood. So
Will that be taped or?
it will.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, thank
Oh,
you.
is it going to be streamed because we had some people online that were asking?
It won't be live streamed because we can't be totally sure what either of these two guys
That
are
was
going to
such a
say.
lovely.
So-
It was such a
Accurate.
lovely vintage reference. Will it be taped?
Accurate.
It was.
Yeah.
Uh,
I loved it.
but it will be posted.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll share the link out.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.